Pope Leo XIV knelt in the Vatican's most sacred chapel at 4 in the morning, surrounded by priceless art and golden crucifixes. Yet feeling spiritually bankrupt, and what happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, power, and the heart of God. The marble floor pressed cold against his knees through the white papal robes, a physical reminder of the weight he carried. Around him, centuries of accumulated wealth gleamed in the flickering candlelight Byzantine mosaics depicting Christ's Passion. Renaissance masterpieces worth millions, reliquaries housing fragments of saints' bones. At the ornate crucifix before him, he felt nothing but hollow emptiness. For the growing chasm between his daily ceremonial duties and the radical teachings of the carpenter from Nazareth, hands trembled as he clasped them tighter. 63 years old, 22 of them as a priest, 8 as pope, and he was losing his way. The morning would bring another day of audiences with diplomats, blessing ceremonies for the wealthy. Carefully worded statements that offended no one and challenged nothing. When had his faith become performance art? The golden tabernacle caught the candlelight, throwing dancing shadows across the chapel walls. Inside rested the consecrated host body of Christ, according to his deepest beliefs. Walked dusty roads with fishermen and tax collectors, not marble halls with cardinals and politicians. Remembering his younger self, the seminarian who had wept reading the Beatitudes, who had dreamed of serving the poorest and most forgotten. That man felt like a stranger now, buried beneath layers of protocol and papal responsibility. A sound echoed from the corridor outside the Swiss guard, changing shifts, that mattered to everyone except his soul. Clothes, he needed to find Christ again. But where could a pope search for God? The papal jet hummed through the stratosphere 30,000 feet above the Pacific, carrying Pope Leo XIV toward Seoul and what his itinerary called historic interfaith dialogue, though his heart carried him toward something far more desperate than diplomacy. Cardinal Toretti, his secretary, shuffled through briefing papers across the aisle, occasionally glancing up with the practiced concern of a man who had managed PayPal schedules for 50 years. Your Holiness, the Korean Buddhist delegation, is particularly eager to discuss environmental stewardship, and the Islamic representatives have prepared extensive remarks on, yes, Cardinal. Through the small window, endless ocean stretched below, indifferent to the carefully orchestrated summit that awaited him. 3 days of measured words, diplomatic smiles, and photograph opportunities that would accomplish nothing except filling. News cycles. The flight attendant approached with practiced reverence, offering tea in fine china bearing the PayPal seal. Leo accepted it with a nod, watching steam rise from the delicate cup. Even here, surrounded by luxury that would feed dozens of families, the emptiness from the chapel clung to him like incense. The Seoul Cathedral has prepared a special mass. For Sunday, Toretti continued, oblivious to his superior's internal turmoil. Archbishop Kim expects over 20,000 faithful. Your homily on unity and diversity should resonate powerfully with unity and diversity. Leo repeated the phrase, tasting its corporate blandness: thirst, personal, immediate, transformative. The cardinal mistook his silence for contemplation. The security briefing suggests minimal disruption. The Korean government has been most accommodating, controlled, sanitized. Every PayPal visit followed the same pattern: bulletproof glass separating him from the faithful. Routes through carefully selected venues, interactions limited to pre-screened individuals with pre-approved questions. How could he find authentic faith in such a sterilized environment? Leo closed his eyes, feeling the jet's steady vibration through his bones. His official schedule would keep him insulated from all of it. The thought struck him with surprising force, dangerous and intoxicating. In Seoul, surrounded by unfamiliar language and culture, who would recognize one aging man in simple clothes? The Lotte Hotel's marble corridors gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Pope Leo XIV pressed his back against the service elevator's cold metal wall. The elevator's narrow window, he watched the 20th floor indicator light fade as he descended toward the parking garage. Above him, Swiss guards maintained their posts outside the papal suite, unaware that their charge had exchanged white robes for the simple black clothing of a parish priest, garments borrowed from his luggage. Leo's hands trembled as he pulled a plain baseball cap low over his silver hair. 63 years of obedience to protocol warred with the desperate hunger that had driven him from his bed at 3 in the morning. When the doors slid open, Underground parking. Garage exhaled the scent of concrete and extraordinary smells that felt like freedom. Emergency exit signs glowed in Korean characters he couldn't read. He followed the universal symbol for stairs, each step carrying him further from the suffocating safety of PayPal protection and deeper into authentic uncertainty. The street-level door opened onto Myeongdong's early morning chaos. Neon signs flickered in languages he didn't understand, advertising everything from cosmetics to street food. The assault on his senses was immediate, and overwhelming car horns blaring in unfamiliar rhythms, conversations flowing in melodic Korean, the sizzle of cooking oil from invisible vendors. Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the sidewalk and vanished into the crowd. A businessman in a crisp suit brushed past without recognition. An elderly woman in traditional hanbok glanced at him with polite indifference. Children laughed as they hurried toward school, their voices carrying the universal music of youth. Shoes clicked against unfamiliar pavement as he walked without destination, letting the city's current carry him. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, arranging displays of items he couldn't identify, calling to him with the promise of authentic experience. Behind him, the luxury hotel grew smaller with each step. Ahead lay 8 million strangers, who might teach him something about faith that no cathedral ever could. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Cardinal Toretti. Leo XIV turned it off and walked deeper into the unknown. The narrow alley twisted away from Seoul's main thoroughfares like a hidden artery. Scent stopped him cold. Garlic, ginger, something rich and nourishing that spoke directly to his soul's hunger. He paused beneath a faded awning where Korean characters he couldn't read promised sustenance in their graceful strokes. Through a small window clouded with steam, warm light spilled onto the alley's worn stones. The aroma that had captured him grew stronger here, wrapping around him like an invitation he couldn't refuse. Leo pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface as he peered inside. The restaurant was tiny, perhaps 8 tables, crowded into a space no larger than his private study, but where his study felt tomb-like in its marble perfection. This place pulsed with life. An elderly Korean woman moved between steaming pots with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these motions 10,000 times. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore an apron that had seen decades of faithful service. As she ladled something golden into a bowl, spooned noodles for his daughter, while his wife laughed at something the child had whispered. The little girl's eyes crinkled with joy as she slurped her soup, radiated through the window like warmth from a fire. This was what he had lost, what all his PayPal audiences and diplomatic ceremonies had slowly bled from his life. Authentic human connection, the sacred ordinariness of shared meals and genuine laughter. The presence of God dwelling not in golden tabernacles, but in the space between people who truly saw each other. Leo's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. Everything about this moment violated protocol. He spoke no Korean. He had no idea what they served or whether they would welcome a stranger. His security detail would be frantically searching for him by now, and an international incident could erupt from his disappearance. But the emptiness in his chest ached more than his fear of consequences. Through the glass, the grandmother looked up from her cooking, and their eyes met across cultures, languages, and a lifetime of different struggles. Something passed between them in that instant of recognition that transcended words. She smiled and nodded toward the door. Leo XIV stepped across the threshold into warmth. The bell above the door chimed softly as Pope Leo XIV stepped inside, immediately enveloped by warmth that had nothing to do with the steam rising from countless bowls of soup and everything to do with the gentle chaos of a family at work. "Anjing the grandmother said, bowing slightly as she wiped her hands on her apron. Her weathered face creased into a welcoming smile that needed no translation. Leo returned the bow awkwardly, his Italian pronunciation mangling the Korean greeting. Annyong. . He gestured helplessly, heat rising in his cheeks. Had he last felt so utterly vulnerable? Even during his most challenging PayPal audiences, he had the armor of ceremony and protocol. Here, stripped of every advantage except basic human decency, he was simply a lost man seeking shelter. The woman's eyes lit with understanding. and something else, a motherly recognition that transcended language. She gestured to an empty table near the window, speaking rapidly in Korean, to a young man who emerged from the kitchen carrying steaming bowls. The son, for the resemblance was unmistakable, paused when he saw Leo, his expression shifting from routine hospitality to puzzled curiosity. He said something to his mother in rapid Korean, tilting his head toward the stranger. The grandmother waved dismissively and approached Leo's table with a grace that reminded him of the sisters who had taught him in seminary, women who communicated more through presence than words. She set down a glass of water and studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a foreign text. "Miguk?" she asked, pointing at him. "American?" Leo shook his head. "Italia?" "Italian." Her face brightened with delighted surprise. "Ah, Italia." She turned toward the kitchen and called out excitedly to unseen family members. Soon, a young woman appeared carrying a toddler, followed by two school-aged children whose curious stares made Leo's heart clench with unexpected tenderness. The grandmother gestured to herself, "Kim Halmioni." Then she pointed to her son, Min-jun, to daughter-in-law, So-young. Each grandchild received an introduction accompanied by gentle pushes forward. When she looked at him expectantly, Leo hesitated. His papal name felt too heavy for this simple space, too laden with ceremony and distance. Instead, he pointed to himself and said simply, "Leo." "Ah, Leo." Halmioni clapped her hands together as if he had given her a precious gift. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later, carrying a bowl that made his mouth water just from the aroma. As she set it before him, her aged hands briefly covered his in a gesture of blessing that struck him more profoundly than any episcopal consecration. Somehow, without sharing a single word of common language, they understood each other perfectly. Halmioni retreated to the kitchen, but Pope Leo XIV could hear her urgent whispers in rapid Korean, punctuated by the occasional Italia and gestures he couldn't see but somehow felt. The family dynamics shifted around him like a carefully choreographed dance, suddenly disrupted by an unexpected partner. Min-jun approached the table, carrying a fresh pot of tea, his movements careful and deliberate. His eyes held the wariness of a man trying to solve a puzzle while maintaining perfect politeness. "Excuse me," he said, in careful English, each word chosen with precision. "You are ... priest." Leo's hand instinctively moved to his throat, where his clerical collar would normally rest. In his borrowed black clothing, perhaps some quality of bearing had given him away the way he held his hands. The unconscious gesture of blessing he'd made over the soup, something that marked him as a man accustomed to sacred rituals. "Yes," he answered simply. Unsure how to explain further without revealing too much, Min-jun's face transformed with understanding and something approaching awe. He bowed, deeper than his mother's casual greeting, and spoke rapidly to his wife, in Korean. So-young's eyes widened as she looked at Leo with new recognition. Gathering her children closer in the universal maternal gesture of presenting one's treasures to an honored guest, the youngest child, perhaps 4 years old, broke free from her mother's gentle restraint and approached Leo's table with the fearless curiosity of youth. She pointed at his hands, then at her own, chattering in Korean. When Leo smiled and nodded, she giggled and ran back to her mother's arms. Halmioni emerged from the kitchen carrying a small bowl of banchan pickled vegetables arranged with artistic precision. But it was her expression that stopped Leo's breath. The puzzled hospitality had been replaced by something deeper, a maternal recognition that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. She set the dishes before him with ceremonial care, then surprised him by sitting across from him at the small table, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she studied his face with the intensity of a grandmother reading her grandson's heart. "Lonely," she said in accented English, the word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. This woman, who had known him for minutes, had identified the ache that decades of papal counselors had failed to touch. He nodded. Not trusting his voice, she reached across the table and patted his hand with the same tenderness she had shown her grandchildren. "Here, no lonely," she said softly. "Here, family." Something inside Leo's chest began to unknot. For the first time in years, the naengmyeon arrived in a bowl that seemed too humble to contain something so transcendent: cold buckwheat noodles, swimming in a clear broth that tasted like summer rain and forgotten prayers. Pope Leo XIV lifted the chopsticks with unpracticed hands, fumbling until Hermione demonstrated with gentle patience, her weathered fingers moving with the grace of decades. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds, the quiet slurping, that she encouraged with approving nods and the distant hum of soul traffic beyond the steamed windows. Leo found himself relaxing into rhythms he hadn't known. He'd missed the simple meditation of shared food, the absence of conversation that demanded careful diplomatic parsing. Hermione refilled his tea with movements that felt ritualistic, sacred. When she looked at him over the rim of her own cup, her eyes held depths that reminded him of the oldest icons in the Vatican, faces that had witnessed suffering and emerged with something deeper than mere survival. "My husband," she said quietly, pointing to a small photograph on the wall behind the register. A man in military uniform smiled back at them, frozen in black and white youth. "Korea War, no come home." Leo set down his chopsticks, the weight of her simple words settling over him like incense. She had been young once, perhaps 20 when that photograph was taken. 60 years of widowhood, of raising children alone, of serving others while carrying her own grief in the quiet spaces between customers. "I'm sorry," he said, the English words feeling inadequate for the canyon of loss in her voice. She nodded, then gestured to his hands. "You also, ... carry heavy things." It wasn't a question. Somehow, this woman who had lived her entire life in a world removed from Vatican corridors and papal ceremonies recognized the particular weight that bent his shoulders, the burden of representing hope to others while struggling to find it for himself. Leo looked down at his hands, pale and soft from a lifetime of blessing sacred objects rather than working soil or kneading dough. "Yes," he whispered, "very heavy." Hermione reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. Her palms were rough from decades of labor, marked by small burns from countless pots of soup, croche-hashed with lines that told stories of sacrifice he was only beginning to understand. "Heavy things," she said, lighter when shared. Through the kitchen doorway, Leo caught sight of Minjun, speaking quietly with So-young, their expressions troubled. The young father held a piece of paper, perhaps a bill or medical document. His wife's face carried the particular strain of parents wrestling with impossible choices. Even here, in this sanctuary of warmth, shadows lingered. The conversation in the kitchen grew quieter, more urgent, and Pope Leo XIV pretended not to notice, while Hermione refilled his tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The family's careful politeness couldn't entirely mask the undercurrent of worry that had settled over the small restaurant like gathering storm clouds. As she settled him at a nearby table with a small bowl of rice, Leo noticed something that made his chest tighten. The child's movements were careful, deliberate, the cautious coordination of someone much older than his years, gesturing toward the boy with the particular tenderness grandmothers reserved for wounded birds. She pulled out her phone and showed Leo a series of photographs, the same child running, laughing, climbing playground equipment with the boundless energy of healthy youth. His usual careful English abandoning him in the weight of what he needed to communicate. He gestured to his son, then to his heart, pressing his hand against his chest and shaking his head. "Broken," he managed. "Doctors say, very expensive fix." The medical documents he'd been holding found their way to Leo's table bills, printed in Korean and English. Numbers that told a story of mounting desperation, cardiac surgery, specialist consultations, medications that cost more per month than most families earned, feeding him rice with infinite patience while he struggled with chopsticks that seemed too heavy for his small hands. Her smile for the boy was radiant. But when she glanced toward the papers, Leo saw the particular anguish of a mother watching her child suffer while feeling powerless to help. "We work," Minjun said, gesturing around the restaurant. "Morning, afternoon, night, but not enough, never enough." Hermione's weathered hand found Leo's arm. "He is good boy, very good heart." But heart, she touched her chest, her eyes filling. His small face, serious with concentration. This child, who should have been racing through alleys and climbing trees, instead measured each movement against the fragile organ that kept him alive. The boy looked up suddenly and smiled at Leo, a smile so pure, so completely trusting, that it shattered something fundamental in the Pope's carefully constructed emotional walls. Here was suffering without pretense, love without condition, faith without institutional blessing. Here was where God actually lived. Despite their crushing financial burden, the Kim family transformed their modest restaurant into a banquet hall, moving tables aside to create space. Around a low wooden platform where Pope Leo XIV found himself seated, cross-legged like an honored patriarch, overwhelmed by generosity that defied every rational calculation. Dish after dish appeared as if summoned by some ancient hospitality, ritual older than Christianity itself. Kimchi that sparkled with fermented fire, bulgogi that melted on his tongue like prayers made edible. Banchan arranged in small ceramic bowls, like jewels scattered across the low table, each one a small masterpiece of flavor and care. Halmi moved between kitchen and dining area with the fluid purpose of a conductor orchestrating a symphony of nourishment. His earlier worry temporarily set aside in service of welcoming this stranger who had somehow become family. So-young guided her children through the elaborate courtesies of Korean dining, teaching them to serve their guest before serving themselves. "Please, please," Leo protested as young Jimin, moving carefully but determinedly, placed the choicest piece of meat on his rice bowl. The boy's effort, given his fragile condition, felt like witnessing a miracle in reverse, the sick child caring for the healthy man. But his protests were met with gentle insistence and laughing dismissal. This was their way, their expression, of something deeper than mere hospitality. As Leo watched Halmione place more food before him than the entire family would share, he began to understand the profound mathematics of sacrifice that governed this household. They were giving him their finest ingredients while their bank account drained toward medical bankruptcy. They were offering wine while rationing their own joy. They were creating abundance from scarcity through the simple alchemy of love, choosing generosity over self-preservation. In Italy, Leo said carefully, "We say fare una bella figura, too. Make a beautiful showing. But this," he gestured helplessly at the feast surrounding him, "this is more beautiful than anything in the Vatican." Minjan poured soju into Leo's glass with ceremonial precision. "Guest is blessing," he said in his careful English. "We honor blessing." As they toasted with the traditional jonbei, Leo felt tears threatening behind his eyes. These people, who possessed almost nothing by Vatican standards, had created wealth beyond PayPal treasuries. They had taken a lonely stranger and transformed him into beloved family. They had offered him everything while asking for nothing. He was sitting in the presence of the divine, and it looked nothing like he had imagined. It looked like a Korean grandmother ladling soup with hands that shook from exhaustion, but never wavered from love. As the evening wound toward its inevitable end, Pope Leo XIV approached the restaurant's small counter with the determined stride of a man accustomed to having his will enacted, only to discover that Korean hospitality possessed a stubbornness that could humble papal authority. He reached for his walleta, simple leather fold containing euros and emergency credit cards that could access Vatican accounts worth billions. "Please," he said to Minjun, who stood behind the register with his arms crossed in polite but absolute refusal. "Let me pay for this beautiful meal." "No, no." Minjun shook his head vigorously, his hands pushing away the offered money as if it were something dangerous. "Guest no pay. Never guest pay." Halmione emerged from the kitchen, took one look at the standoff, and added her own emphatic denial. She waggled her finger at Leo with the authority of a woman who had settled this argument 1,000 times before. "You blessing to us. Blessing, no pay for blessing." The older children clustering behind their grandmother like a protective wall. Their united front was both touching and frustrating to a man accustomed to having his generous impulses accepted with grateful ceremony. "But you've given me so much," Leo insisted, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to explain the unexplainable. How could he tell them that this simple meal had fed something in his soul that decades of Vatican banquets had left starving, that their company had provided communion more meaningful than any mass he'd celebrated? "We give nothing," Halmione said firmly. "You give us honor. You sit at our table, eat our food, make our house blessed. We receive gift from you." Leo looked around at their faces, each one glowing with the satisfaction of hosts who had perfectly fulfilled their duty. They genuinely believed they were the recipients in this exchange. Their logic was unassailable and completely maddening. In my country, he tried again. It is very important that I pay for my honor. This gave them pause, cultural sensitivity, warred with hospitality protocols in their expressions. Minjun and Halmioni exchanged rapid Korean, clearly debating how to navigate this diplomatic crisis. Finally, Halmioni approached Leo and patted his cheek with maternal gentleness. "Your honor, save with us," she said softly. "Our honor require we protect guest, no money." Leo XIV stood at that counter, holding currency that could fund their son's surgery 10 times over, and found himself completely powerless against the beautiful tyranny of their love. The irony was not lost on him. He who commanded the obedience of 1 billion Catholics couldn't convince one Korean grandmother to take his money. The weight of what Pope Leo XIV needed to say pressed against his chest like a physical force as he looked at the Kim family gathered. Around him, their faces still glowing with the satisfaction of perfect hospitality. He took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "My name," he said quietly, "is not just Leo." The simple statement hung in the air like the first note of a song that would reshape their understanding of reality. Tilted his head, confusion replacing his earlier certainty about payment protocols, Leo reached into his jacket and withdrew a small silver cross, the pectoral cross that marked his PayPal office, the one piece of regalia he had been unable to leave behind. He held it in his palm where the restaurant's warm light caught its surface. "I am Pope Leo XIV, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the leader of the Catholic Church." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sounds of Seoul traffic seemed to fade into nothing. Halmioni's weathered hand flew to her mouth. Soyoung's eyes widened until they seemed to encompass her entire face. Minjun staggered backward as if physically struck. "Your son," Leo continued, his voice gaining strength from their stunned silence, "will have his surgery. All of it, the best doctors, the finest care. I will personally ensure that money is never again an obstacle to his healing." Jimin, still drowsy in his mother's arms, looked between the adults with the puzzled expression of a child watching incomprehensible adult drama unfold. "No," Minjun whispered, shaking his head in denial. "No, cannot be possible." "You fed me when I was hungry," Leo said, his own voice breaking with emotion. "You welcomed me when I was a stranger. You showed me what faith looks like when it's lived instead of merely preached. This is not charity, this is what God does, through people who love without condition." Halmioni sank into a nearby chair, her hand still pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Soyoung began to sob great, gasping sounds of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. "But we are nobody," Minjun stammered. Just small restaurant, family. "We cannot accept such ... You are everything," Leo said firmly. "You are exactly who Christ told us to serve, and exactly who taught me how to serve." Looks like the restaurant seemed to shimmer with something beyond mere electric light, as if the veil between divine intention and earthly reality had grown gossamer thin. Miracles, Leo realized, often began with a grandmother's soup, the Seoul streets that had seemed foreign and overwhelming, just hours earlier, now embraced Pope Leo XIV like familiar arms as he walked back toward the Lot Hotel, his heart fundamentally altered by the alchemy of authentic love. The neon signs still flickered in Korean characters he couldn't read, but their light no longer felt alienating. Instead, they seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the prayers he had rediscovered in a grandmother's kitchen. Each step carried him further from the small restaurant, but deeper into the understanding that had bloomed there like flowers in unexpected soil. The weight that had pressed against his chest for years, the burden of representing God while feeling increasingly distant from him, had lifted somewhere between the kimchi and Jimin's trusting smile. In its place sat something lighter, yet more substantial. Purpose, rooted in love rather than obligation. His phone had been buzzing frantically for the past hour with calls from Cardinal Toretti, the Swiss Guard, and undoubtedly half the Vatican. By now, an international incident was brewing in his absence. Diplomatic schedules were crumbling, and security protocols lay in ruins. None of it mattered. For the first time in decades, Leo felt the presence of God walking beside him on ordinary pavement, as real and immediate as the Seoul air filling his lungs. He paused at a street corner where an elderly man sold newspapers. From a small cart, bowing slightly to the vendor who returned the gesture with surprised courtesy. Such a simple exchange, yet it carried the weight of everything the Kim family had taught him about dignity, respect, and the sacred nature of everyday human encounters. The memory of Halmione's tears still glistened in his mind, not tears of despair, but of overwhelming gratitude that transcended language and culture. When he had finally convinced them to accept his help, when Minjan had knelt on the restaurant floor and sobbed with the relief of a father whose child would live, Leo had witnessed something more profound than any PayPal audience or ceremonial. Blessing, he had seen the face of God reflected in their faces. 3 blocks from the hotel, his phone rang again. This time he answered, "Your Holiness." Cardinal Toretti's voice crackled with barely controlled panic. "Where are you, security?" "Team has been searching." "I'm safe, Cardinal," Leo said calmly, surprising himself with the peace in his own voice. "And I'm exactly where God wanted me to be. But the schedule, the summit meetings tomorrow, will proceed as planned. But there will be changes to my homily at Seoul Cathedral." Leo paused, watching a young mother cross the street with her child, both of them laughing at some private joke. Significant changes. As he approached the hotel's gleaming facade, Leo caught a glimpse of his reflection in the revolving doors. Pope Leo XIV, but somehow more himself than he had been in years. The desperate spiritual hunger that had driven him from his chapel that morning had been fed. Not with theological abstractions or ceremonial grandeur, but with kimchi and kindness. Broken English and boundless love would proceed, but he would speak with a voice renewed by genuine encounter rather than diplomatic necessity. The carefully prepared remarks about unity and diversity felt hollow now compared to what he had experienced, unity born. Not from political correctness, but from the recognition that suffering and love wore the same face in every culture, every language, every heart. 2 weeks later, in the cardiac surgery unit of Seoul National University Hospital, young Jimin Kim played with toy cars on his hospital bed while his parents signed discharge papers. The surgery had been a complete success, the Vatican's finest. Medical connections had ensured access to the world's leading pediatric cardiac surgeon, and the boy's repaired heart now beat with the steady rhythm of limitless possibility. Sat in the chair beside the bed, her weathered hands folded in prayer. Not prayers of desperation this time, but prayers of thanksgiving so profound they seemed to transform the sterile hospital room into something approaching sanctuary. Minjun approached his mother, carrying a newspaper with a front-page photograph of Pope Leo XIV addressing a crowd of 50,000 at Seoul Cathedral. The headline, translated into Korean, read, "Pope calls for Church of Radical Hospitality in Historic Seoul Address." Halmione Minjun said softly, "The Holy Father spoke of a small restaurant family who taught him about true faith. He told the world about our kindness, but he never mentioned your name." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes crinkling with the same joy that had first welcomed a lonely stranger into her world. "Good," she said simply. "Secret, heaven knows our address." Outside the hospital window, Seoul sprawled in organized chaos. 8 million people living real lives, facing real struggles, seeking real hope. And somewhere in the Vatican, a pope who had rediscovered his calling, prepared to spend the rest of his papacy, ensuring that the church's doors, like a grandmother's restaurant, remained open to any hungry soul brave enough to step inside. The revolution had begun with soup and ended with love. It was, Leo reflected, exactly how Christ would have wanted it. And in a small noodle shop somewhere in Seoul, Halmione was probably preparing tomorrow's broth, unaware that she had become an unwitting architect of papal transformation, a saint without a title, working miracles one bowl at a time.